Hey guys, tonight we slip into a shoreline that doesn't quite exist anymore. You're standing where the land is flat and dark, and the ocean breathes in slow, patient pulses, like it has all the time in the world. Because honestly, it kind of does. The air tastes faintly of salt and wet stone. Somewhere behind you the ground is cold enough to sting through your shoes, and somewhere ahead waves keep rewriting the edge of the world in little white lines. And floating above all of it is our question, quiet but stubborn. What if the last Anunnaki king vanished in a 13,000-year cataclysm? We'll keep this safe and honest, because that's how you get a channel monetized and a brain relaxed at the same time. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, some parts are calm what-if imagination. We'll use cautious verbs because the past is not a courtroom. It might suggest, it may hint, it could fit. Historians debate. And you probably won't survive this, not because anything is chasing you, but because you would absolutely forget your water skin, underestimate the cold, and try to look heroic while shivering. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me your location and your local time down in the comments. I love picturing this as one big sleepy campfire spread across different time zones, all listening to the same waves. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You keep your eyes on the water as if it's about to speak. In the dark, the ocean is never one colour. It's charcoal, then ink, then a softer grey, where moonlight catches the crest of a wave and turns it into a thin blade of silver. You're near the end of the last ice age, a time most historians agree is marked by huge changes in climate, sea level and human life. The evidence we do have points to a world where ice sheets still loom in the north, where coastlines sit farther out than today, and where the weather can turn moody without warning, like it's trying to decide what century it wants to be. And here is where we plant our first solid anchor. Archaeology suggests that many people live close to water because water is food and travel and safety, and occasionally the only thing between you and a long, miserable walk across empty land. Fish, shellfish, seaweed birds, seals in some regions, and all the small practical gifts of tide and river mouth. You can feel why coasts matter just standing here. Even if you know nothing about prehistory, your body understands this part immediately. The beach is a pantry if you know what you're doing. It is also a trap if you don't, which is comforting in a weird way, because it means you and ancient humans share at least one trait. You both learn fast, or you get very hungry. So you walk. Not marching, not striding, just moving in that slow rhythm that makes your thoughts stretch out like warm taffy. The sand is packed hard near the waterline. Each step leaves a clean print that fills with a thin sheen of water, as if the sea is politely trying to erase your evidence. The wind slides past your ears with a low hush. It's the kind of sound that makes you want to whisper even though you're alone, because loudness feels rude in a place this old. Most historians agree that around 13,000 years ago the world is in motion. The last glacial maximum is already behind you. And warming trends have started the long process of melting ice sheets. But the path is not smooth. There are swings, pauses, reversals, and regional differences that make any single storyline feel too neat. Historians still argue whether certain sudden climate shifts are best explained by changes in ocean circulation, atmospheric patterns, volcanic effects, or a combination of multiple forces that don't care about your need for a clean narrative arc. That debate matters because you're not just asking about water, you're asking about memory. You're asking whether something people experience could later be described as a cataclysm, and whether that description could grow a crown and a throne and a name attached to it. Here's a careful interpretation signposted as such. One interpretation is that when communities witness rapid environmental change, they encode it into story form so it can survive. Not as a scientific report, obviously, more like a warning wrapped in a poem. A shoreline moves, a river changes course, a lagoon turns salty, a familiar hunting ground becomes a shallow bay. If you tell your children, you might not say sea levels rose by X meters over Y centuries. You might say the sea walked inland when the sky was angry. You might say the old land sank. You might say there was a day the world ended, and we began again. And now gently we drift into the mist, without pretending it's solid ground. A fringe idea proposes that some of these flood stories found in different cultures preserve echoes of real ancient inundations. This theory isn't widely accepted as a single global event, with one timeline and one cause, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes interesting in the way a half-seen shape in fog is interesting. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pause where the sand becomes pebbly. The stones are smooth and cold, polished by waves over lifetimes. You pick one up. It's heavier than you expect. Your palm warms it slightly. A small object, a tiny weight, and suddenly you're aware of the enormous physics around you. The moon pulls the water. The wind pushes the surface. The shoreline is a negotiator between forces that don't speak your language. And that's where the title of tonight's story starts to behave. What if the last Anunnaki king vanished in that kind of negotiation, not as a superhero disappearing in a flash of light, but as a rumour dissolving into a landscape that won't hold still? What if a court, a city, a lineage, a sacred role, whatever you imagine, when you hear king was simply unable to survive, when the land itself stopped cooperating? Let's step carefully into what's documented. In mainstream Mesopotamian tradition, the Anunnaki appear in texts as a group of deities. That's broadly accepted, and it's important because it frames them as religious figures in a later written record, not as a confirmed list of rulers you can file next to census data. The evidence we do have points to these names living inside mythic and ritual language. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So why are we even saying king? Because later cultures, including in ancient Mesopotamia, do talk about kingship and divine sanction, and lists of rulers that reach back into a hazy myth-soaked past. A careful reading might suggest that when later scribes describe early times, they blend memory, ideology, and storytelling. The king can become a bridge between human society and the cosmos. And once you have that narrative habit, it becomes very easy for modern audiences to read those stories as literal chronicles. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's tempting to treat myth as either nonsense or secret history. Both extremes are lazy. A more cautious explanation could be that myth is a kind of cultural storage. It keeps ideas safe. It explains social order. It gives shape to fear, and it offers comfort about randomness. It might also preserve a few stubborn facts, like a kernel of shell inside a pearl, but you shouldn't assume every pearl contains a shell, and you definitely shouldn't build your entire diet around pearls unless you enjoy dental emergencies. You keep walking and the wind changes. It comes from the land, now colder, carrying a faint smell of damp grass and smoke. Somewhere inland people have fire. Not a palace, not a marble staircase, just a fire, because fire is the first technology that makes the night less bossy. Archaeology suggests that humans at this time used stone tools, bone tools, wood, fibre, and hide. They know their landscapes with intimate detail. They understand the habits of animals. They can read weather like you read a phone screen, except their phone screen is the sky and it never updates automatically. And here comes our first small joke, because you need one to keep your modern brain from clenching up. If you time travelled back here with your current skill set, you'd last maybe 3 hours before asking the nearest stranger where the charging outlet is. Spoiler, the outlet is a rock, and it charges you by humbling you. You find driftwood, a pale twisted branch, bleached and smooth. You run your fingers along it. It's light dry on the outside, still holding the ghost of salt. This becomes your motif, your small object to keep the story stitched together. Driftwood is what happens when a tree loses its certainty. It's carried, scraped, reshaped, then offered back to land in a new place. It doesn't explain itself. It just arrives. Now we move to the Cataclysm part, but with caution. Most historians agree that sea levels rose significantly after the Ice Age, but the pace varied and the impacts depended on local geography. A slow rise can still feel sudden if you live in one place and notice that the high tide reaches a new stone each year. A faster pulse, which some research suggests may have happened in certain periods, could feel like a trauma you talk about for generations. Historians still argue whether specific events like rapid meltwater pulses were experienced as abrupt disasters at human scales everywhere, or whether they were regionally dramatic but globally spread out across time. You stand with the driftwood in your hand and look out again. And now we let the imagination breathe, clearly labelled as such. What if on a night like this a community watches the sea behave wrong? Not just high tide, not just a storm, something stranger. The water stays high, it doesn't retreat the way it should. The wind isn't violent, but the ocean seems restless, like it has received instructions. What if the last Anunnaki king as a story is the person you blame when your world stops obeying the old rules, or the person you mourn because you need a face for the loss? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the king might not be a literal ruler sitting on a throne. He could be a role, a ritual figure, a title worn like a mask representing order itself. And when the land breaks its promises, the title vanishes because order has nowhere to sit. A popular rumour claims that ancient stories hide records of a global flood that wiped away an advanced civilization. This is debated, and it's not mainstream history as stated. To be clear, this is debated. But what's useful about the rumour is not whether it's literally correct. It's that it reveals a human instinct. When we see ruins, we imagine a bigger past. When we feel fear, we invent a grand reason. When we face randomness, we ask for kings and gods, because chaos doesn't give interviews. So you walk a little farther and the shoreline curves. The waves get quieter as if they're tired of performing. The pebbles become sand again. Your driftwood feels warmer in your hand. Your breathing slows. You're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And here is the final turn for this section, gentle and steady. You look down at your footprints and you realise the sea is already smoothing them away. That's the feeling of prehistory. Most of it is erased while you're still standing there. You can still infer a path, you can still study the sand, you can still make careful guesses, but the tide keeps coming. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the vanishing of a last Anunnaki king is really a way to talk about vanishing certainty, vanishing coastline, vanishing old life patterns? Archaeology suggests change is the constant. Most historians agree people adapt, migrate and reorganize. One interpretation is that catastrophe becomes a story because stories are the boats that carry you over dark water. You turn the driftwood in your hand like a slow thought. The ocean exhales again, and without stopping, without making a big deal out of it, you keep walking along the edge of a world that is quietly, patiently rearranging itself. Your pace stays unhurried, the kind of walking that makes time feel less like a schedule and more like a tide. The shoreline keeps offering you small details, as if it's trying to keep you entertained without raising its voice. A strip of seaweed clings to a stone like a tired ribbon. A gull calls once, then goes silent, probably because even it realizes it's being a little dramatic for bedtime. The driftwood is still in your hand, light, stubborn, a tiny piece of land that has already learned how to travel. You turn it over and feel the grain under your thumb, the way it catches slightly, as if it's trying to remind you that every surface has a story. Archaeology suggests that small, ordinary objects can carry meaning far beyond their size, especially in societies where you don't own much, but you remember everything. A careful reading might suggest that when later people talk about ancient kings or gods, they may be compressing generations of lived experience into a single symbol you can hold in your mind. Most historians agree that the late Ice Age world is not a blank, empty wilderness. It's busy, it's peopled, it's full of roots and relationships, of seasonal movements, of shared knowledge that doesn't leave a paper trail. What's broadly accepted is that humans have been spreading across many regions for tens of thousands of years, adapting to forests, steppes, coasts, mountains, and river valleys. And if you imagine yourself here, you start to understand why maps would exist even before ink. Your map is the smell of a wet cave that means shelter. Your map is a certain bend of river where fish gather. Your map is the stars over a familiar ridge. Your map is honestly your knees. If they hurt at the wrong moment, that's a geographic limitation. Historians still argue whether large-scale cultural shifts at the end of the Ice Age are driven more by climate pressure, population growth, innovations in technology, or changes in social networks. There's no full consensus because humans don't change for one reason at a time. You change because winter is harsher, and because you have a new tool, and because your cousin married into a different group, and because you got tired of walking so far for water. Reality is messy. That's why history is interesting, and why your laundry pile keeps returning like a tragic sequel. You angle slightly inland, where the sand gives way to tougher ground. The grass is thin, patchy, still recovering from cold seasons. Your feet crunch over shell fragments. The air smells less salty now, more earthy, like damp soil and old leaves. If you close your eyes, you can almost taste the difference on your tongue. This is the edge between worlds, sea and land, wet and dry, known and unknown. It's a good place for stories to stick. Now let's anchor again. Archaeology suggests that many prehistoric communities favoured rivers and lakes as much as coasts, because fresh water is non-negotiable. Rivers are also highways. They guide you through landscapes, offer predictable resources, and connect different groups. Most historians agree that long before formal states, humans still trade, share, and communicate across surprising distances, passing along shells, pigments, obsidian and ideas, the way you pass along a good rumour, except their rumour might be, hey, there's a valley where the deer are always fat, and yours might be, hey, did you hear that someone microwaved a fork? One interpretation is that when later civilizations write about ancient kings, they may be projecting later political ideas onto earlier times. That's not an insult to the ancients. It's a common human habit. You do it too. You look at a childhood photo of yourself and assume you were thinking in complete sentences with fully formed adult logic. You were not. You are mostly thinking about snacks and chaos. And in the same way, later scribes may look back and describe early leadership as kingship, even if leadership back then is more flexible, more communal, more situational. Still, the title we're following tonight has a certain pull. A last Anunnaki king, a vanishing, a cataclysm. It's cinematic. It's mysterious. It makes your brain sit up, then we gently pat it back down. Like, we're not running anywhere. So what could a map feel like in this world before paper? Imagine you're walking with someone who knows the route. They don't point at a drawn line. They point with their chin. They say we follow the river until it narrows, then we go toward the two hills that look like sleeping animals. Then we find the spring that tastes like stone. Then we camp where the wind can't reach us. The story of the route is the route. The route is remembered by repeating it. And when the landscape changes, the story changes. Most historians agree that sea level rise after the Ice Age reshapes coastlines dramatically over thousands of years. The evidence we do have points to shorelines retreating, estuaries forming, islands appearing, land bridges disappearing. Historians still argue whether particular episodes of sea level rise happened quickly enough to be witnessed as sudden disasters in some places, but even gradual change can feel like betrayal if you depend on a specific beach for shellfish or a specific marsh for birds. Here's the interpretive angle again clearly flagged. It's possible that oral traditions preserve impressions of these shifts, especially when they alter food sources or sacred places. A careful reading might suggest that flood stories are not always literal global floods, but metaphors for displacement, loss and forced adaptation. And now the what if mood, soft and dreamy. What if you are walking not just through geography, but through the process of memory being rewritten in real time? You stop by a small stream cutting through the land on its way to the sea. It's not wide, but it's quick, clear, cold. You kneel and dip your fingers in. The water bites bright and clean. You can picture a camp nearby, not in a fantasy way, but in a practical way. A fire ring, a few stone flakes, a hide stretched to dry, someone watching the horizon because they're responsible, or because they're anxious, or because they want an excuse to be alone for a minute. People are people. You look at the driftwood, and suddenly it seems like more than driftwood. Not because it actually is, because your mind wants to assign roles to objects. The driftwood becomes a pointer on your invisible map, a marker of where you started, a motif that says, remember the sea moves things, and then the land adopts them. Now we bring in the king idea with care. A fringe idea proposes that there may have been complex social hierarchies far earlier than we typically imagine, perhaps connected to ritual centres, trade networks, or charismatic leaders. This theory isn't widely accepted in the strongest form people sometimes present online, but it's fair to say that early societies can be more socially complex than a simple stereotype of small bands suggests. Archaeology suggests gatherings, feasts and shared projects occur in some regions. That doesn't equal monarchy, but it does suggest coordination, status and influence. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The existence of coordination does not confirm a crown. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can imagine how later storytellers might turn an influential ritual leader into a king, especially if his role is associated with cosmic order, calendars or survival knowledge. And this is where we quietly stage our cinematic what if. What if somewhere along these watery routes there is a person whose job is to remember the map in an almost sacred way? Not a king in a palace, but a keeper of routes, seasons and signs. The one who says when to leave, where to go, when the fish will run, when the storms will come. In a world without written records, that kind of knowledge can feel like authority. It can feel like leadership blessed by something beyond ordinary life, even if it's just experience and observation. Historians still argue whether the earliest myths of divine kingship reflect real ancient social roles or later ideological needs. That debate is your guardrail. It keeps you from turning bedtime wonder into bedtime certainty. The stream whispers beside you, your fingers dry in the wind. You stand again and keep moving, following the water inland for a time, as if you're testing how far the map can stretch. And you notice something quietly unsettling in a calm way. The land has scars, not wounds, nothing dramatic, just hints of change. A line of stones that looks like an old shoreline, a shallow depression that might once have held water, a cluster of shells far from the current tide line. The evidence we do have points to landscapes shifting, and archaeology suggests ancient shorelines can sometimes be traced through sediments, shell layers, and landforms. It's a reminder that even if the ocean looks gentle tonight, it has the power to redraw everything. You squeeze the driftwood once, like you're holding a small handrail in the dark, and you let the thought drift in slow and safe. What if the last Anunnaki king doesn't vanish because someone defeats him, but because the map he rules disappears? What if the Cataclysm is not a single day of doom, but a long, relentless editing process, where the world crosses out the familiar and writes in the new? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You take a breath that smells like damp grass. You listen to the stream and the distant sea, two rhythms overlapping like a lullaby. And you keep walking, letting your invisible map grow one careful step at a time. You follow the stream until it thins and braids through stones. Then you drift away from it, the way a tired thought drifts away from a sentence. The land rises in gentle folds, not mountains, not drama, just the kind of rolling terrain that makes your calves complain politely. The air cools. The smell changes again, less salt, more crushed plant, more mineral. You can feel the night settling in like a blanket that doesn't quite cover your feet, but still tries its best. The driftwood stays with you, and now it feels almost funny that you're carrying it inland away from the sea that shaped it. But that's what humans do. You take pieces of the old world into the new one. You keep a shell from a beach you loved. You keep a key from an apartment you no longer live in. You keep a playlist from a version of yourself you pretend you never were. No judgment. Archaeology suggests that even early communities curate objects and materials that matter to them, sometimes transporting items across distances that seem inconvenient unless you assume meaning is involved. Most historians agree that around this time, human groups in many regions are still largely mobile foragers. What's broadly accepted is that food strategies vary by environment. Some groups focus on hunting large animals when available. Others lean heavily on fish, birds, plants, nuts, tubers. Still others mix everything in a flexible way because being picky is a luxury. The evidence we do have points to sophistication, not simplicity. You don't survive harsh seasons by being clueless. You survive by being observant, cooperative, and occasionally stubborn in the best way. One interpretation is that the way later civilizations describe the beginning can be misleading. A careful reading might suggest that when ancient texts talk about early times, they often compress, stylize, or mythologize what were actually long, gradual processes. That matters for tonight's theme because a cataclysm in story form might be a poetic summary of change rather than a literal single moment. and our cinematic what if soft as fog. What if the last Anunnaki king belongs to that compression, a king shaped out of centuries, because humans like their mysteries with a face? You come upon a flat area sheltered from wind by a line of scrub and low trees. The ground is drier here. You can imagine a camp not with fantasy torches and dramatic chanting, but with practical decisions. Where the smoke will go, where the water is, where you can see danger coming, where the children won't roll downhill in their sleep. The tiny logistics that make survival possible. Archaeology suggests that many early camps leave subtle traces. A scatter of stone flakes, a hearth stain in soil, burnt bone fragments, bits of pigment. Sometimes those traces don't survive. Sometimes they do. And that's the big, frustrating romance of prehistory. You can be standing in a place where people laughed, argued, cooked, told stories, and you'd never know unless the ground kept a receipt. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of social inequality appear primarily through control of resources, ritual, authority, trade influence, or simply the charisma of certain individuals in particular contexts. There's no full consensus because early societies are not one universal template. They're local, they're adaptive, they're messy. Also, humans have always had that one person who talks like they're in charge, even when nobody asked, so we should factor that into the archaeological record just emotionally. Now we lean into the bullet promise for this section. The mini title was about cities that are not cities yet, and we keep that exact idea. Most historians agree that true cities, in the sense of large, dense, permanent urban settlements with complex administration, appear much later than 13,000 years ago, especially in Mesopotamia. The evidence we do have points to gradual steps, seasonal aggregation sites, larger villages, ritual centres, intensified food production, and eventually the kinds of settlements that begin to look city-like. So what do you call a place that pulls people in before you have streets and writing and taxis? You call it a gathering. You call it a meeting ground. You call it a seasonal magnet. Archaeology suggests that people may come together for feasting exchange, marriage alliances, ritual activity, or simply because the landscape offers a resource peak that makes gathering efficient. In some places, big game migrations, fish runs, or plant harvest seasons could create a natural reason to concentrate. One interpretation is that when later civilizations tell stories of ancient kings, they may be reaching back toward these gathering places, projecting a political shape onto something that might have been social and ritual instead. A careful reading might suggest that king could sometimes be a later label placed on earlier leadership roles, like a translator using the closest modern word, even if it doesn't match perfectly. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let's keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You sit for a moment on a rock that still holds a little warmth from the day. Your shoulders loosen, your breathing slows. You look at the driftwood across your knees like it's a microphone, and you resist the urge to interview it. You're a professional, mostly. Now the Anunnaki part. What's broadly accepted is that Anunnaki shows up in Mesopotamian mythology as a group of deities associated with the underworld and divine assembly in certain texts depending on period and context. This is not a straightforward, consistent category across all writings, and scholars debate nuances of meaning and function. That's important because it reminds you the term is part of a later written culture, not a proven label for Ice Age rulers. A popular rumour claims that these names encode literal extraterrestrial visitors or a hidden civilization that ruled humanity. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for it is thin in mainstream archaeology. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour still tells you something about modern imagination. People love to plug holes in the past with grand answers. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. A more cautious explanation could be that later religious language uses grand imagery to describe power, order, fate, and the relationship between humans and the cosmos. Over time, those images can be read too literally by audiences hungry for secrets. So what do we do with Last Anunnaki King in a monetization-safe way? We interpret it as a narrative device, a symbol, a thought experiment. One interpretation is that the king could represent an idea of order that collapses when the environment collapses, or it could represent a lineage of memory keepers whose authority fades when landscapes change, or it could be a later mythical figure inserted into the deep past as a way of saying the old world ended and something else began. You stand again and walk through the imagined camp space as if you're practicing being careful where you step. You can almost hear small sounds, not ghosts, not spooky, just the normal soundtrack of humans, a baby fussing, someone chewing something crunchy, someone poking a fire and pretending they know what they're doing. A quiet argument about whether to move tomorrow or wait for better weather. Humans have always had meetings, and humans have always wanted to end meetings, so there's continuity. Historians still argue whether the shift from foraging to farming is driven by crisis opportunity, experimentation, or social competition. But even before farming, there are moments when people gather and build social worlds that leave hints in the ground. And that is where a king-shaped story could attach itself. Now, for your second light joke, because you deserve it. If you were in charge of this gathering, you'd try to organise everyone with a group chat. And then you'd realise there is no signal, no electricity, and also half the people here politely do not care about your agenda. Leadership is humbling. So is the lack of snacks. You lift the driftwood and hold it like a baton. You imagine it once floated past a coastline that no longer exists. You imagine it once brushed against reeds in a lagoon that is now dry land or deep sea. The evidence we do have points to coastlines migrating. Archaeology suggests the sea swallowed many ancient places where humans lived, worked and told stories. That's one reason prehistory feels like a book with missing chapters. So here comes the cinematic what if whispered. What if the last Anunnaki king vanishes because his city is one of those missing chapters? Not a city of towers, but a gathering place with meaning. A sacred shoreline, a ritual hill, a seasonal crossroads. And when the sea advances, it doesn't just take ground, It takes the stage where the story could have been remembered in detail. You don't need doom music for that. The quiet is enough. You step away from the sheltered spot and look toward the distant shimmer where the sea would be. It's out of sight now, but you can feel it in the air like a presence. You keep walking slow and steady, carrying driftwood like a small promise. And you let yourself sit with a final careful line. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Tonight you're letting the deep past be deep. You're letting it be incomplete without rushing to fill it. Because the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You keep moving until the ground starts to feel less like a beach hinterland and more like a true interior, a place where the wind has to work harder to find you. The night air is dry enough to make your lips feel a little tight, and the sky is so open it looks freshly cleaned. Stars sit there with that smug ancient confidence, like they've never once forgotten where they parked. You roll the driftwood in your hand as you walk, and it's almost absurd to carry something ocean made through a landscape that feels made of stone and distance. But that absurdity is kind of the point. People carry meanings across environments all the time. Archaeology suggests that long before writing, humans still shape the world with intention, sometimes in ways that surprise modern assumptions about what early life could look like. Most historians agree that around the end of the Ice Age in parts of what we now call Southwest Asia, people begin building something that looks startlingly organised. Not cities yet, not palaces, not the kind of skyline you put on a postcard, but places with structure, with purpose, with repeated patterns. The evidence we do have points to communities capable of planning, cooperation, and ritual behaviour that goes beyond mere survival. And then, like a lantern appearing ahead on a dark path, a name enters the landscape. Göbekli Tepe. Archaeology suggests that Göbekli Tepe includes monumental stone enclosures built by people who are often described as hunter-gatherers, dating to roughly the early Holocene. T-shaped pillars, carved animals, circular arrangements that seem deliberate, not accidental. Most historians agree this site complicates the old, neat storyline that farming comes first, then villages, then temples. Here you have something that looks temple-like, before full agricultural life is firmly established in the usual way the story gets told. Historians still argue whether Göbekli Tepe represents a strictly religious centre visited seasonally, a broader social gathering hub, a complex settlement with ritual architecture, or something that shifts function over time. That debate matters because it sits right at the edge of our theme. If the old assumptions wobble, your imagination naturally leans in, and you have to keep your balance without falling into certainty. You slow your steps, not because anyone is chasing you, but because your brain is trying to picture how people pull off something like this without modern machines. You can almost feel the weight of stone in your shoulders, even though you're just listening. The night is quiet, but your mind supplies the sound: stone scraping on wood, people grunting, someone shouting directions, someone rolling their eyes because the directions are not helpful, and someone else pretending they are the foreman because they once carried a slightly heavier rock and it changed their personality. One interpretation is that ritual, shared belief, and social bonding could drive big cooperative projects even before formal states exist. A careful reading might suggest that gathering for ceremony creates networks, alliances, and obligations, and those networks can look like a proto-society, not a state with paperwork, but a shared system of meaning. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the origin of complexity might be less about grain storage and more about people needing reasons to gather, to trust, to commit to each other when the world feels unstable. Now let the what if mood drift in soft as a breath. What if the last Anunnaki king is not a person whose bones you could dig up, but a symbol that forms in places like this? What if king is a story shaped around the idea of leadership in ritual, around the one who speaks for the gods, or reads the sky, or announces the seasons? Not a crown, but a role. Not a throne, but a circle of stones. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mainstream safe anchor stays clear. Göbekli Tepe is a real archaeological site with extraordinary early monumental construction. The interpretation is that such sites might reflect complex ritual networks. The imagination is that stories of vanished rulers could grow from the kind of awe these places produce. You imagine walking among those pillars at night the way you are walking now, and you imagine the carvings catching moonlight. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, animals that look like they're stepping out of stone. Archaeology suggests the imagery is intentional and varied, though scholars continue to debate what exactly the symbols mean. There's no full consensus on whether the animals represent clan emblems, mythic beings, warnings, cosmology, or a mix of meanings that change over time. You make a little joke to yourself because you have to. If you were asked to interpret a carved vulture on a stone pillar after a long day of hauling rock, you'd probably say it means I need a nap, and then you'd be accidentally correct in a spiritual sense. Your modern brain loves to decode. Ancient brains did too. Everyone wants the world to be readable. A fringe idea proposes that some ancient sites encode advanced astronomical knowledge far beyond what we typically attribute to early societies, sometimes tied to dramatic claims about lost civilizations. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for sweeping conclusions is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, it's fair to say that humans have long watched the sky carefully. The stars are a calendar you can't lose. And if you can predict seasons, migrations, rains, you gain influence, even if you never say the word power. You stop beside a low rise and look out. The land rolls away into darkness. The sea is not visible, but you can still hear it faintly when the wind shifts. You hold the driftwood up for a second, and it looks like a pale bone against the night sky. Something water-made now, surrounded by stone. Most historians agree that the shift into the Holocene brings new ecological possibilities, warmer conditions in many areas, different plant distributions, more stable environments in some regions, though not everywhere and not always. Archaeology suggests that people respond by experimenting, by intensifying resource use, by building more persistent places to return to. Not because someone flips a switch and invents civilization, but because choices accumulate. One interpretation is that moments of environmental upheaval and recovery can reorganize social life. If coastlines move and familiar grounds disappear, people may cluster in new zones, negotiate new relationships, and create new stories to explain why the world changed. The story of a vanished king could be a way to narrate that transition, not as a documentary, but as meaning. Now the cinematic what-if tightens just a little like a thread pulling through cloth. What if the 13,000-year cataclysm, whatever, its local shape leaves survivors with the need for a new centre, a place to gather, a place to mark time, a place to decide who leads and why? And what if the last Anunnaki king is the title given to the last leader of an old world pattern, the last one who holds authority in a way that feels ancient and cosmic? Before leadership becomes more practical, more administrative, more tied to stored grain and counted labour. You keep walking and your feet find a rhythm that feels like a drumbeat slowed down for sleep. You toss in another gentle joke because the brain enjoys a small laugh before it loosens. Imagine trying to explain to a committee of early builders that you have a revolutionary new idea called a spreadsheet. They would stare at you, then hand you a rock and say, "Great, you can start by moving that." The driftwood grows warmer in your hand, warmed by your palm. Your small motif keeps you grounded. The sea changes the wood. The land tests your endurance. The people of this world test each other's trust. And somewhere in that triangle, stories form. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if Anunnaki King is not a hidden ruler, erased by disaster, but a poetic shape that helps later cultures talk about origins, legitimacy, and loss? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You breathe in the dry night air and the silence feels friendly now. The stars don't move, but the world beneath them does. And you keep going, carrying driftwood, like a quiet question toward whatever human hands might build next when the shoreline stops being reliable. The land keeps rising in small, patient steps, and you start to notice how your body becomes its own quiet instrument. Your breathing measures distance. Your heartbeat measures effort. Your skin measures wind. Your eyes measure the sky, because there is no roof up here, only space. The stars look closer now, not because they are, but because you are farther from distractions that pretend to matter. You pause on a ridge, where the ground is bare and stony, and the night air feels crisp enough to snap. The driftwood rests in your palm like a pale question mark. It's still strange carrying sea-made wood under an ocean of stars. But you keep it because humans love a prop, and because it keeps your thoughts from drifting too far into the mist. Archaeology suggests that long before formal calendars, people pay close attention to cycles. Day and night, seasons, animal migrations, plant harvests. Most historians agree that skywatching is a practical skill as much as a spiritual one, because the sky is the original reminder app. It never runs out of battery, it never needs an update, and it never asks you to accept cookies. You learn where the sun rises in different seasons. You learn which stars appear before the cold sets in. You learn which moon phases make night travel easier. You learn mostly that nature does not care about your plans. You take a few careful steps and find a scatter of stones that seems a little too tidy. Not a wall, not a building, just a rough ring, as if someone once placed rocks with intention. It could be nothing. Stones roll downhill, animals kick things, people return to the same spots and accidentally arrange a pattern over time. The evidence we do have points to humans using landscape features as reference points, and sometimes marking those points with simple constructions. But it's not always easy to tell purpose from coincidence in deep time. One interpretation is that even simple stone arrangements can serve as memory anchors. A careful reading might suggest that a ring of stones helps you remember where a group meets, where a fire pit belongs, where a burial lies, where a story should be told, or where the view of a horizon aligns with a particular sunrise. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the first calendars might not be carved into tablets. They might be built into routine, built into the body, built into the way you look up at the same part of the sky every time you return. You sit on a flat rock and let the cold seep into you just enough to make you grateful for warmth. Your shoulders loosen. The driftwood lies across your knees, pale against the dark. You glance at it and almost laugh because it looks like a pointer stick you'd use in a classroom, except your classroom is the entire night. Most historians agree that in many ancient cultures the sky becomes a storybook. Constellations turn into animals, heroes, tools, warnings. Archaeology suggests that people make meaning out of the heavens because the heavens are steady while life on the ground can be chaotic. And in a world where coastlines move and weather shifts, stability is a comfort. The stars become the one thing you can trust to show up. Historians still argue whether early astronomical knowledge spreads mostly through practical observation for survival, through ritual specialists who gain status by predicting seasonal changes, or through a mix of both that shifts from place to place. That debate sits right where our theme likes to live, because if someone can read the sky, they can lead. Not with a crown necessarily, but with credibility. If you know when the rains might come, you decide when to move camp. If you know when a certain star rises, you decide when to fish a certain bay. If you can predict an eclipse, even roughly, people might look at you like you have a hotline to the universe. And you might not correct them because you also enjoy not being ignored. Now gently we bring in the Anunnaki-shaped idea without pretending it belongs here as a proven fact. What's broadly accepted is that later Mesopotamian cultures develop rich astronomical traditions and link gods to celestial bodies in complex ways. The evidence we do have points to the sky playing a major role in religion and statecraft once writing and cities emerge. One interpretation is that later stories about divine assemblies and cosmic order may echo much older instincts to map meaning onto the heavens. That's not the same as saying the Anunnaki are literally present in this Ice Age night. It's saying humans have long used the sky to support stories about order. And now, your cinematic what if, soft as a blanket settling. What if the last Anunnaki king is not a literal monarch, but a story shaped around a sky reader? the last one whose authority feels ancient and mythic right at the edge of a world that is changing too fast. What if his vanishing is timed not only to water and climate, but to a breakdown in the old calendar, the old signs, the old way of predicting what tomorrow will look like? You tilt your head back and pick out patterns. You see a cluster that could be a tool, another that could be a bird, another that could be nothing at all, just random sparks. And yet your mind insists on making it something because your mind is a pattern-addicted creature. Here's your first light joke for the section. If your brain lived in a modern apartment, it would label every cloud as a different animal, then demand applause for its creativity. You are not alone. Humans have always done that. You run your thumb along the driftwood and imagine it floating under a different sky. A sky seen from a coastline that is now gone, swallowed, or reshaped by time. The evidence we do have points to sea level rise after the Ice Age, and archaeology suggests many coastal sites are submerged today, which means some of the human story is literally underwater. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. A fringe idea proposes that ancient monuments in various parts of the world align with stars or solstices so precisely that they must have been designed by advanced lost civilizations with knowledge far beyond their time. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the safer explanation is that careful observation over generations can produce impressive accuracy, especially when you have lots of time and a strong reason to care. Still, it's a fun thought to hold loosely. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes a mood, not a verdict. A mood where the sky feels like a code. You stand and walk around the stone scatter, counting your steps like you are measuring something, even though you are mostly measuring your own curiosity. You face the horizon and you imagine a sunrise. Not because it's about to happen, but because your mind likes to rehearse survival. One interpretation is that horizon watching could be a way to mark time, and that marking time could become sacred. A careful reading might suggest that the line where Earth meets sky is where humans place meaning because it is both real and unreachable. Second light joke. Imagine telling a group of Ice Age sky watchers that you have a new and improved calendar on your phone and it will remind you of every important date. Then imagine the phone dies and they just stare at you in complete silence until one of them points at the moon like, "Buddy, it's right there. The moon is free. The moon is reliable. The moon does not need you to plug it in." You return your attention to the stones and wonder who placed them. Maybe nobody. Maybe everybody over time. Maybe a child played a game. Maybe someone outlined a fire pit. Maybe someone wanted a marker that said, "Here, this is where we return." Archaeology suggests that repetition is powerful. A place becomes important because you keep coming back, not because someone announces it is important. And if you keep coming back, you start to tell stories there. Stories become rituals. Rituals become identity. Now the last Anunnaki king returns as a whisper of possibility. A popular rumour claims that the greatest secrets of ancient kingship are hidden in star lore, that rulers once tracked cosmic cycles to predict disasters and maintain control. This is debated and it's easy to overstate. But a more cautious explanation could be that leaders, once leadership becomes formal, often use calendars and celestial timing to organize labor festivals and legitimacy. If you know when to plant, when to harvest, when to declare a holy day, you coordinate society. And coordination can look like magic if you're hungry enough. Third light joke. If you ever want to feel like a powerful ancient ruler, just tell a room full of people the exact minute you plan to serve dinner. They will treat you like a prophet. It's not charisma, it is scheduling. Humans are weak to snacks. You breathe out and watch your breath fade. You grip the driftwood and let it remind you that the sea is still out there, moving, reshaping, stealing. What if the last king vanishes because the old signs fail? What if the cataclysm is not only water but uncertainty? The kind that makes people stop trusting the person who says, "I know what the sky means." Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Tonight you keep them separate like stones placed carefully in a ring. You look up once more, let the stars blur slightly as your eyes relax, and you keep walking, carrying your small sea-made relic into a night where the sky feels both familiar and endlessly unreadable. You walk until the stones underfoot soften into soil again, and the wind calms down as if it's finally remembered this is supposed to be a bedtime channel. The sky stays enormous, but the land becomes more intimate. Low shrubs, a few twisted trees, a shallow hollow where the air feels slightly warmer, sheltered. You sink into that warmth the way you sink into a blanket that smells faintly like laundry and safety. The driftwood is still with you, and now it has become a kind of quiet credential. Not proof of anything, not evidence, just a reminder that the sea moves and the land receives. You turn it in your hand and notice a small notch, a natural split in the grain that looks almost intentional. Your mind instantly tries to make it a symbol. Humans have always been like this. We see faces in clouds, we see meaning in scratches, we see destiny in a fortune cookie that mostly says try again tomorrow. Most historians agree that long before writing, people still tell complex stories. The evidence we do have points to symbolic behaviour deep in the past: art, ornament, burial practices and shared rituals. Archaeology suggests that storytelling is not a luxury add-on, it is a survival technology. It passes knowledge, bonds groups, and helps you make sense of loss. And now we step into the promise. For this section, a king-shaped rumour in clayless times. Because this is the strange part, isn't it? We're talking about kings before we have clay tablets, before we have ink, before we have lists. So we have to be careful. We have to speak like adults in a room full of evidence and imagination, keeping them from fighting. What's broadly accepted is that written records in Mesopotamia appear much later, around the late 4th millennium BCE, with early cuneiform. Most historians agree that before writing, leadership and social organisation still exist, but they are harder to reconstruct. Archaeology suggests that power can show up in different ways. Differential burials, specialised buildings, control of trade routes, or ritual authority. But you don't get tidy names and dates. One interpretation is that when later literate societies look backward, they project the structures they know into the deep past. That's not malicious, it's natural. A careful reading might suggest that the human mind prefers beginnings with characters. It wants an origin story with a main figure, someone to blame, someone to praise, someone who can carry the weight of change, so you don't have to say the world shifted slowly and nobody was in charge. Historians still argue whether the earliest concepts of kingship begin as practical leadership, sacred mediation, military organization, or some blend that changes over time. There's no full consensus because the evidence is patchy, and the word king itself is a translation that carries modern baggage. You kneel near the hollow and press your palm into the soil. It's cool, slightly damp. You find a small flake of stone, sharp-edged, clearly worked. Your fingers know it instantly the way you know a key by touch in the dark. Archaeology suggests stone knapping produces distinctive flakes, and those flakes can linger as quiet signatures of human presence. This is a mainstream anchor. People were here. People did things. People left the smallest traces and took the biggest memories with them. Now we gently introduce the later Mesopotamian material that inspires the king idea while keeping the timeline honest. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian texts written millennia later that include king lists and mythic narratives. Most historians agree that some lists blend historical rulers with legendary ones, and that these documents can serve political and ideological purposes as well as preserving tradition. One interpretation is that the famous idea of a great flood dividing eras in Mesopotamian king lists reflects a cultural memory of disruption. A careful reading might suggest that the flood line is not a precise timestamp, but a narrative hinge, a way of saying there was an old world, and then there was the world we recognize. That's where your cataclysm energy slips in without needing a literal global event. And now we let imagination step forward, but with a soft disclaimer. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. What if in the long oral corridor between Ice Age life and written Mesopotamian myth, certain story shapes persist? The shape of a leader who keeps order, the shape of a divine council, the shape of a world reset by water, the shape of a last ruler who disappears, not because he is defeated, but because the world becomes unrecognizable. A fringe idea proposes that ancient king lists preserve literal records, stretching back far beyond what mainstream chronology supports. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the safer reading is that king lists mix memory, ideology, and myth. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still use the idea as a storytelling lens, a way to explore how societies stitch meaning across deep time. You stand and walk a slow circle around the hollow, like you're tracing an invisible boundary. It feels ceremonial, even if it's just you being dramatic with your feet, and you can't help it. The night makes you poetic. Here comes your first light joke for the section. If you were tasked with preserving the complete history of your life without writing anything down, you'd probably start strong. Then eventually, the story would devolve into, and then there was that one time I ate something questionable and regretted it for 3 days. Oral tradition is powerful, but it's also human. It keeps what matters. It edits what doesn't. It turns details into lessons. Now we talk about the 13,000-year cataclysm with care again. Most historians agree that around the transition toward the Holocene, climate changes and sea level rise alter landscapes significantly. The evidence we do have points to regional variability, not a single universal catastrophe. Historians still argue whether certain abrupt shifts were experienced as sudden disasters in specific regions or as cumulative stress over generations. So how do you get a vanishing king out of that? One interpretation is that leadership roles change when environments change. If your authority depends on knowing the old coastline, the old seasonal timing, the old resource routes, you can lose credibility when those patterns break. A careful reading might suggest that this is the social heart of many myths. The old wise leader fails not because he becomes foolish, but because the world changes the rules. Now the cinematic what if arrives like a quiet wave. What if the last Anunnaki king is the last keeper of an old map of meaning? He stands at a gathering speaking with confidence about where the fish will be, where the safe crossing is when the winter will loosen its grip. People listen because he has been right before. Then one season he is wrong. The water doesn't retreat. The storm comes early. The crossing is gone. The camp is flooded. The old rules fail. To be clear, this is debated and speculative. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. But as a story, it makes emotional sense. It shows how catastrophe can be social before it is geological. The cataclysm is not only water, it is trust-breaking. Second light joke. Gentle. Imagine being the king and giving the confident speech like, don't worry, the tide always drops by midnight, and then the tide is like, actually, I'm trying something new tonight. You would immediately want to blame the moon, the gods, your neighbour, and probably a suspicious-looking bird. Accountability is hard in any era. You sit again this time on the edge of the hollow and you hold the driftwood upright. In your sleepy mind, it looks like a scepter made out of beach leftovers. Ridiculous. Perfect. A symbol that is not a symbol unless someone decides it is. A popular rumour claims that certain ancient stories hide coded references to advanced rulers who manipulated early humanity. This is not widely accepted and evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that myths use exaggerated beings to talk about power dynamics and human vulnerability. The Anunnaki as deities in later texts can be read as part of a mythic language for fate authority and the structure of the universe, not a literal genealogy of Ice Age kings. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And that's the bedtime sweet spot. You can let the idea exist without needing it to be true. You can explore how it feels. You stand brush dirt from your hands and take one last look at the hollow. You imagine it filled with people with voices with smoke. You imagine a story being told, passed mouth to ear across generations. Maybe it changes. Maybe it gains a king. Maybe it gains a divine name. Maybe it gains a flood. And you keep walking, carrying the driftwood and the question together as if both are fragile and both deserve a gentle grip. You drift onward until the land begins to slope back down, not sharply, just enough that your body recognizes it as a return toward water. The air changes before you see anything. It gets wetter, heavier, and the night carries that faint metallic tang that always seems to hover near big bodies of water. Your driftwood feels less like an odd souvenir now, and more like it's quietly heading home, even if you're the one doing the walking. You reach a point where the ground flattens and opens, and in the distance you sense a dark, wide shape. Not the ocean this time, but something inland that holds water the way a cupped hand holds breath. A lake, a sea, a broad bay, it doesn't matter yet. What matters is the feeling water as presence, water as boundary water, as something that can give you life and also rearrange your plans without asking. Most historians agree that the end of the Ice Age includes major shifts in sea level, with coastlines moving dramatically over thousands of years. The evidence we do have points to episodes where melting ice contributes to pulses of rising water. Archaeology suggests these changes affect where people can live and how they move, especially in low-lying coastal and riverine zones. One interpretation is that a cataclysm in human memory might not require a single global flood. A careful reading might suggest that for a community living in a vulnerable place, a rapid change in shoreline, a breach of a natural barrier, or an unexpected surge could feel like the end of the world they know. And now the cinematic what-if mood, calm and vivid. What if you are approaching the exact kind of threshold where stories are born, where water crosses a line it never crossed before? You walk along the edge of this wide water, keeping to slightly higher ground. The surface is dark and still in the centre, but near the shore it trembles with small ripples. The wind carries a soft slap of waves against mud and reeds. You can smell it, wet earth, decaying plant, the faint sweetness of stagnant pockets, the clean sharpness of open water. If you've ever stood near a lake at night, you know the smell is like a memory you can't place. Now we lean into the mainstream anchor for this section. Many scholars discuss post-glacial sea level rise and the submergence of coastal plains. Some also explore specific regional flooding scenarios. A well-known debated example involves the Black Sea region, where there are hypotheses about rapid marine flooding through a connection with the Mediterranean. Most historians agree that the details of timing, rate and extent are complex and contested, and that the evidence has to be interpreted carefully. Historians still argue whether the Black Sea experienced a sudden catastrophic flood event at a scale and speed that would have been dramatically witnessed by local communities, or whether changes were more gradual and regionally variable. That exact phrase matters tonight because it keeps us honest. The debate is real. The evidence is debated. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. One interpretation is that flood myths in later cultures may echo memories of regional inundations or of people being forced to move when waterlines shift. Another interpretation is that flood stories can be symbolic narratives about social resets, moral lessons, or the unpredictable force of nature. A careful reading might suggest both can be true at once. Stories can carry more than one kind of truth. And now we let the imagination do what it does best without pretending it's evidence. What if you stand on a ridge above a valley and you watch water creep in day after day until one morning the line has jumped, not the slow, polite advance of the tide? A sudden push, a breach, a roar that doesn't match the wind. What if the reeds bend and the birds lift in a panic, and you hear in the distance the sound of something ancient breaking open? You keep your breathing steady. No fear-mongering, no panic. Just a quiet awe for the physics of water and the fragility of human plans. You tighten your grip on the driftwood and it feels suddenly symbolic again, even if you don't want it to. The stick is light, but in your mind it becomes a marker, like a ruler against which you measure change. This is the calm part of disaster noticing, measuring, realizing you might have to leave. Most historians agree that humans adapt through mobility, social networks, and flexible strategies. Archaeology suggests that when environments shift, people often relocate, regroup, and retool their lives rather than simply disappearing. One interpretation is that the story of a vanished king could be a way to narrate leadership during relocation. A careful reading might suggest that a king in this sense is not a palace figure, but a decision maker during crisis. The one who says, we go now, we go that way, we carry this, we leave that. Now bring in the Anunnaki theme, with monetization safe framing. A popular rumour claims that ancient flood stories are records of an event that erased a high civilization, sometimes connected to the Anunnaki in modern retellings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for a single global cataclysm wiping out an advanced society is thin in mainstream archaeology. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour still gives us a powerful what-if mood. What if the last Anunnaki king is a figure? Later imagination attaches to the moment. Water changes everything, because humans like to personalize the impersonal. The sea has no face, so the story gives it a drama. A king vanishes, and the world resets. You walk along the ridge and look down into the dark water. The surface reflects the stars in broken patterns. One step left, the reflection is crisp. One step right, it shatters into ripples. The world looks steady until it doesn't. Historians still argue whether people at the end of the Ice Age experienced changes primarily as slow shifts across generations, or as acute shocks from extreme events layered on top of long trends. There's no full consensus because both can happen. A gradual rise can be punctuated by a sudden storm surge. A stable shoreline can be interrupted by a barrier breach. And in human memory, the punctuations are what get remembered. Here comes your first light joke in this section. If you've ever watched someone try to carry too many groceries in one trip and then drop everything right at the door, you've witnessed a tiny modern cataclysm. Now, scale that feeling up to a whole community deciding what to carry as water rises. Humans will still insist on taking the one unnecessary object. There will always be someone hauling a carved stool, like I need this for my vibe. You imagine the scene softly, a group on higher ground, fires burning low, people watching the dark water below. Someone older speaks in a calm voice because panic helps nothing. Someone younger wants to run because adrenaline is loud. Someone else is quiet staring because their home is down there. And somewhere among them is the figure we are treating as a possibility the last king. Not because he wears gold, but because he carries responsibility. One interpretation is that leadership under pressure can become mythologized later. A careful reading might suggest that the person who guided people through a disaster becomes larger in story, more symbolic, more cosmic. If later scribes hear fragments of such stories, they might fold them into grand narratives about floods and divine order, especially when their own societies are built along rivers and live with water as both blessing and threat. Second light joke. Imagine trying to hold a royal ceremony on a muddy ridge while everyone is cold and hungry. The king would raise a ceremonial staff, and someone would be like, "Please, with all respect, can we focus on not drowning?" Even mythic leadership still has to deal with logistics. You hold up your driftwood and picture it as that ceremonial staff for a moment, then you laugh quietly at yourself and lower it again. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And now the closing image for this section, calm and cinematic. What if the vanishing is not a disappearance into magic, but a loss into water and time? A leader steps down into a flooded path to retrieve something or to guide someone, and the water takes him. Or he chooses to stay behind so others can move faster. Or he simply becomes a story because no one saw exactly what happened in the chaos of relocation. To be clear, that's a possibility, not a certainty, but the emotional truth of it feels human. Water rises, people move, someone is lost. The story needs a name. The story needs a reason. The story needs a king because kings make chaos feel like a chapter rather than a random accident. You walk on along the ridge, the water breathing below you, and you keep your steps slow, letting the sound of small waves do what it does best, erase sharp edges from your thoughts. You keep to the higher ground because your instincts are practical even in a story. The ridge under your feet is firm, and the water below is a dark, listening thing. The air tastes damp now, and your skin picks up a fine chill, as if the night is quietly reminding you that warmth is something you have to earn. You walk until the landscape feels like a bowl, a broad basin of darkness, where water gathers and holds. The surface is calmer here, more lake than ocean, but there is a tension in it, a sense of waiting. Reeds whisper, mud sucks gently at the edges. Somewhere out in the black, a fish breaks the surface with a soft plop that sounds louder than it should, like a punctuation mark in an otherwise quiet sentence. Most historians agree that after the last ice age, sea levels rise as ice sheets melt, reshaping coastlines and water connections across many regions. Archaeology suggests that people living near these shifting waters would have to adapt, relocate and renegotiate where food comes from and where safety lies. That part is solid ground. Water changes. Humans adjust. Now here comes the contested waters part, carefully handled. In discussions of post-glacial changes, some scholars propose that the Black Sea region may have experienced a significant influx of salt water through a changing connection with the Mediterranean, potentially flooding low-lying areas. Other scholars argue the timing, rate and extent are more gradual or more complicated than a single dramatic breach. Historians still argue whether this scenario should be pictured as a sudden catastrophic rush that people would witness in a single lifetime, or as a longer, more incremental transformation that still feels devastating when you live through it. You let that debate sit gently because it is the guardrail that keeps your imagination from swerving into certainty. The evidence is debated. The interpretations differ. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You move along the ridge and picture it in your mind, not as a headline, but as a lived experience. If a barrier gives way, if a channel deepens, if water from one basin starts pouring into another, you might hear it before you see it. A distant roar, low and continuous, the kind of sound you feel in your ribs. You might smell it too, the change from fresh to brackish, that subtle sharpness that creeps into everything. You might taste it in the water you scoop in your hands and realize it's not the same water anymore. To be clear, this is a possibility, not a certainty. But even a gradual change can do the same thing to a human mind. One interpretation is that when the world changes in a way you cannot stop, the brain reaches for story shapes that can hold the weight. A careful reading might suggest that floods in myth are not only about water, they are about the moment your familiar map fails. Your driftwood rests in your palm as you walk, and you find yourself using it without thinking, tapping it lightly against stones like a quiet metronome. The sound is soft, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. It feels like counting. It feels like measuring. It feels like you want proof, even though you promised yourself you wouldn't demand it tonight. Here's a small joke to keep your shoulders unclenched. If you had to survive this era, you would absolutely try to solve the whole problem with motivational quotes. You'd stand on the ridge and say, when life gives you floodwater, make it a lifestyle change. And everyone would stare at you with the kind of silence that means, please stop talking and help carry the baskets. You keep walking and the ridge narrows. The ground drops off more sharply on one side and you slow down instinctively. Your breath becomes quieter. Your whole body is listening. That listening is something humans have always done near water. Archaeology suggests people build their lives around waterways because waterways are resources and routes, but they are also unpredictable edges where safety and danger can switch places with no warning. Now we bring in our mystery theme again, safely framed. A popular rumour claims that flood stories across many cultures point to one single world-ending event, sometimes tied in modern retellings to lost civilizations and vanished rulers. This theory isn't widely accepted in that sweeping form, and evidence for a single global catastrophe is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that different communities experience different floods and shoreline changes. Then later their stories echo each other because humans tend to tell similar stories about similar fears. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, You can let the rumour add a cinematic shadow without letting it become a claim. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the repeated flood motif is the human way of saying, the world can change faster than your traditions can keep up? You stop and look down at the water again. The surface holds the moon in a broken path like a road you could walk if you were light enough. The reeds sway. The smell of wet earth rises. You imagine a community living down there on low ground that feels safe until it isn't. You imagine the first signs, a spring that tastes different, a shoreline that doesn't return to its old place, a line of dead plants where salt has crept in. Most historians agree that early communities respond to environmental stress in many ways, including moving to higher ground, diversifying food sources, and strengthening social networks. One interpretation is that leadership becomes crucial during such transitions, and those leaders may later be remembered in mythic terms. A careful reading might suggest that king is sometimes a later title for someone who coordinated survival, who held the group together when the landscape tried to pull it apart. Now the what if takes a gentle step closer, staying firmly in imagination. What if the last Anunnaki king is the name later storytellers give to the last leader of an old water world, a world of freshwater margins and predictable seasons? What if his vanishing is timed to the moment when brackish water invades, when familiar fish disappear, when old routes become impassable, when the very taste of the world changes? Second light joke, because you deserve one right here. Imagine being that leader and trying to reassure everyone with confidence, like it's fine, the water is just doing a little rebrand. And then someone dips a finger in, licks it and goes, no, it's literally salty, and everyone looks at you like you just lied about the weather on purpose. You walk again slower and you notice how quiet your mind becomes when you accept uncertainty instead of fighting it. That's the sleepy magic of deep history when you handle it carefully. You can hold multiple possibilities without needing to choose a single hidden truth. You can say, scholars propose. You can say, historians debate. You can say, we don't have full consensus. A fringe idea proposes that ancient memory of flooding might be preserved with surprising accuracy over long periods, passed down through stories like a living archive. This theory isn't widely accepted as a guarantee because oral tradition changes, merges, and adapts. But it's also fair to say that oral tradition can preserve meaningful information, especially when tied to place ritual and repeated retelling. The evidence we do have points to human memory being both fragile and powerful. Third light joke, soft and quick. You know how someone tells you a story from last weekend, and by the end it somehow includes a dramatic chase scene that definitely did not happen. Now imagine that process across centuries. The core might stay, but the special effects budget definitely increases. You hold the driftwood up again, and for a moment it looks like a small staff. A simple object that could be mistaken for a symbol if you want it to be. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The driftwood is not evidence of kings. It's a motif, a reminder of movement and reshaping. You listen to the water. You imagine the sound of a channel opening, the hush turning into a low roar, the basin filling the shoreline, retreating the old camps abandoned, and you imagine with gentle restraint a leader choosing what to save. Not gold, not monuments, but knowledge, songs, roots, names. A story that says once there was a world here and then the water came. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian societies live with floods and rivers as central realities shaping agriculture, cities and myth. One interpretation is that when literate cultures write down flood stories, they may be layering local river flooding experiences onto older, deeper memories of shoreline change. And the cinematic what if remains a whisper, not a claim. What if the last Anunnaki king vanishes in that layered memory, not as a factual biography, but as the face a culture gives to the moment water redraws the world? You keep walking along the ridge, letting the air cool your cheeks, letting the reeds murmur, letting the water below remain what it is debated, powerful and quietly indifferent to your need for clean endings. You keep walking until the ridge feels less like a safe railing and more like a narrow thought, and then you angle away from the water climbing just enough to get a wider view of the sky. The air up here is colder and cleaner, and it has that faint dry taste you get when there is less moisture to soften anything. Your driftwood taps once against a stone, a quiet little click, and the sound feels strangely loud in a world that otherwise refuses to make announcements. The stars look sharper now, not brighter exactly, just more precise, like someone turned down the haze. You find yourself staring at them the way you stare at a ceiling fan when you cannot sleep, except the sky is more interesting and also less likely to fall on you, which is a nice feature. Most historians agree that the period around the end of the last ice age includes major climate swings, and one of the most discussed is the Younger Dryas stretch, when conditions in parts of the northern hemisphere turn colder again after warming has begun. The evidence we do have points to real changes in temperature and rainfall patterns recorded in multiple kinds of climate proxies. Archaeology suggests that when climate shifts, people adapt, move and reorganize their lives, even if they do not call it climate in the modern sense. And then your story brain leans in because a cold snap in the middle of a warming world already sounds like a plot twist. Historians still argue whether the Younger Dryas is triggered mainly by changes in ocean circulation from meltwater influx, by broader atmospheric dynamics, by a combination of factors, or by other debated contributors. That single sentence is your safety rail. It keeps you from turning a complicated scientific question into a bedtime certainty, because this is where modern myth-making loves to sprint ahead, waving a big dramatic flag. One interpretation is that abrupt climate events can feel like cataclysms at the human scale, even when they are not a single-day event. A careful reading might suggest that a few unusually harsh winters, a run of failed harvests for wild plants, or shifting animal ranges could create a deep sense of instability. And now the cinematic what if, soft and steady, what if the vanishing of a last Anunnaki king is not tied only to rising water, but also to a sky that starts behaving wrong, a season that arrives with the wrong face. You stop and look up again. The stars are calm, but you can imagine a sky that is not in a scary way, just in a way that makes you feel small. A faint streak could cross a meteor common enough that humans have watched them for as long as there have been humans to watch. But even one bright fireball can make a group go silent because it looks like the sky threw something. Here comes your first light joke. If you saw a blazing meteor tonight, your first thought would be, wow, and your second thought would be, should I film this for social media? And your third thought would be, wait, what is social media? I live in 13,000 years ago. Please hand me a rock and a blanket. Archaeology suggests that humans have long paid attention to unusual celestial events because unusual things become stories. A more cautious explanation could be that stories about fiery skies can emerge from ordinary meteor showers, from rare bolides, from volcanic haze, from wildfires, from anything that turns the heavens into a stage. The evidence we do have points to humans being excellent at remembering the feeling of an event, even when precise details blur. Now we step carefully into the debated comet and dust idea. A fringe idea proposes that an impact or airburst event around the younger Dryas boundary contributes to sudden cooling through dust, soot, or other atmospheric effects. This theory isn't widely accepted as settled, and researchers debate the evidence and interpretations. If the evidence is thin or contested, we'll say so. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Still as a bedtime what if it has a particular mood? You can picture it without turning it into a claim. A bright object, a flash far off, a sound that arrives late, a strange haze that lingers. The sky looking slightly different for a season. Even if the cause is debated, the sensation is easy to imagine. You breathe in and your breath looks faintly pale in the cold. The air feels like it has edges. You hold the driftwood closer to your chest for warmth, and you smile because it is ridiculous to hug driftwood. But it also makes sense. It is something solid in a night full of questions. Most historians agree that when climates shift, people respond through flexibility. Archaeology suggests that groups might change migration routes, broaden diets, intensify certain resources, or cluster around more reliable water and food sources. One interpretation is that times of stress can increase the power of specialists, including ritual leaders or skilled planners, because uncertainty makes people hungry for guidance. That is not a guarantee of kingship, but it is a path toward authority. Now bring our theme in gently and honestly. What if the last Anunnaki king treated as a possibility rather than a conclusion is the story shaped around the last leader who claims to understand the world's patterns right before those patterns snap? Not because he is evil, not because he is supernatural, but because he is human, in a moment when humans want certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mainstream anchor stays clear, climate swings happen. People adapt. The interpretation is that social authority might shift during instability. The imagination is that a king-shaped figure could vanish at the edge of that shift. You start walking again and your footsteps crunch lightly over frost-tinged ground. You notice how sound travels differently in cold air. It feels sharper, like the night has better hearing. The world seems to hold still, and then you realize it only seems that way because your own movement has slowed. Second light joke. If you try to run a royal court in this climate, Your main policy platform would be everybody please stop complaining, and then you would immediately be removed from office, because complaining is basically the national sport of cold weather. You reach a spot where the ground dips and the wind pulls. It is colder here. You can almost imagine a brief white dusting on nearby stones. Not a full snow scene, just a hint. You rub your hands together and you think about how quickly comfort becomes the most important thing in the world. Archaeology suggests that in colder periods, access to shelter clothing and reliable fire becomes even more crucial, and those practical needs shape social life. One interpretation is that the memory of a harsh climatic reversal could become mythologized later as a world-ending moment. A careful reading might suggest that stories of darkness, cold, or an angry sky are sometimes ways to narrate survival through environmental stress, and the cinematic what if stays in the whisper zone. What if the 13,000-year cataclysm is remembered not only as water, but as a season when the sun feels weaker and the night feels longer, when the old calendar fails and the old authority fails with it. A popular rumour claims that ancient peoples witnessed cosmic disasters so dramatic that entire civilizations were erased, leaving only myth behind. This is not widely accepted as a straightforward historical account, and evidence for one singular cosmic event doing all that is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that multiple stresses, climatic swings, local floods, and rare dramatic sky events blend in cultural memory, especially when later societies retell them with moral or cosmic framing. Your driftwood taps again, and you use it like a pointer at the sky, tracing a line between two stars. You realize you are doing the thing humans always do. You want the heavens to be readable. You want the universe to be a book with chapter headings. Third light joke. If the sky were a book, you would still skip the introduction scroll straight to the plot twist and then complain that you are confused. Humans are consistent across millennia. You take a long, slow breath and let it out even slower. The air feels like it settles your thoughts. The debate stays where it belongs. Scientists and scholars can argue about triggers and evidence, and you can still honour the mainstream ground without demanding a neat answer. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And that is where the last Anunnaki king as a story can live safely. Not as a proven ruler with a date on a stone, but as a symbol that appears when people need a name for the moment certainty vanishes. A king is a promise of order. A cataclysm is a reminder that order is borrowed, not owned. You keep walking under the stars, the cold air smoothing your thoughts, the way water smooths stone, and you let the sky stay what it is tonight, beautiful, silent, and just uncertain enough to keep the story breathing. You start down the slope again, and with each step the air grows a little heavier, a little warmer, like you're walking into a different mood. The sharp cold from the ridge softens. The scent of damp earth returns. Somewhere below, you hear water moving, not a dramatic roar, just the steady sound of a stream or a marsh channel doing its job. The night has layers, and you're slipping into the lower one. Your driftwood knocks gently against your leg as you walk, and you hold it closer. Not for protection, but for familiarity. It's your small anchor in a landscape that keeps changing. The sea shaped it, but your hand has warmed it. That alone is a kind of story. Most historians agree that when environments shift, people do not just move their bodies, they move their social worlds. Archaeology suggests that migrations can be complex, involving seasonal rounds, repeated relocations, and the reweaving of alliances. The evidence we do have points to resilience. People adjust to new coastlines, new river mouths, new vegetation zones. They adapt because the alternative is not adapting, and that is not a great long-term strategy. Historians still argue whether the biggest driver of post-Ice Age population movements is rising seas, changing rainfall patterns, resource pressures, social competition, or a combination that differs by region and time. That argument is your truth ladder in action. We have solid ground, and we have debate, and we have imagination. We keep them separate, even while we let them flow together like two streams meeting. You reach flatter ground where the soil is darker, richer, and your feet sink slightly with each step. This is a place that holds water, a marsh edge, a floodplain, a wide river valley where the land looks generous in the day and slightly mysterious at night. The air smells like mud and green life. You hear frogs, a soft chorus that feels like it's always been here because frogs are the original background soundtrack. Archaeology suggests that floodplains and river valleys can be extraordinarily productive, offering fish, birds, plants, and later fertile soil for cultivation. Most historians agree that in Southwest Asia, over long stretches of time, people increasingly experiment with managing plants and animals, leading toward agriculture in certain regions. Not in one sudden leap, but as a gradual tapestry of choices, pressures, and opportunities. One interpretation is that some migrations and relocations after the Ice Age funnel people towards stable water sources and productive zones where repeated contact competition and cooperation can accelerate social change. A careful reading might suggest that in crowded or resource-rich places, leaders and organizers become more important because coordination matters when there are more people and more complicated decisions. Now the cinematic what-if mood returns, calm and deliberate. What if you are walking with a group that has just left a drowned shoreline behind? What if you carry not only tools and food, but stories of the old place, the place now underwater, the place that was home? What if someone in the group carries a seal, a token, a carved object, something that stands for authority in the old world? And what if that authority is changing shape with every mile? You pause beside the stream. It's narrow but lively. Moonlight catches on the surface in quick flashes. You dip your hand in and feel the cold rush around your fingers. You imagine a caravan, but not camels and banners, more like families, small clusters, kin groups, allies carrying baskets and wrapped bundles, moving slow, stopping, often watching the landscape for signs of safety. Most historians agree that deep prehistory doesn't give us named refugee columns. The evidence we do have points to patterns rather than biographies. But archaeology suggests mobility and exchange are ancient, and it's possible that dramatic environmental changes could push larger scale movements in certain times and places. That's the mainstream ground. The rest is interpretation and imagination. Here comes your first light joke for this section. If you were part of this migration, you'd insist on bringing one totally unnecessary item like a favourite cup, and then you'd complain about how heavy it is every 10 minutes. Humans are so consistent, it's honestly comforting. Now let's weave in the king-shaped thread carefully. One interpretation is that kingship as later understood might emerge out of older roles: ritual leaders, war leaders, dispute mediators, organisers of feasts, keepers of calendars. A careful reading might suggest that as groups grow and settle, more leadership becomes formalised and stories about divine sanction become useful. This does not mean an Anunnaki king literally rules a migrating Ice Age group. It means later societies might imagine early authority as kingly and attach mythic names to it. A fringe idea proposes that the earliest farming societies may have inherited knowledge from a lost earlier civilization, sometimes tied to modern Anunnaki narratives. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for direct transmission from a vanished, advanced culture is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that humans are inventive, and that experimentation across generations can lead to major changes without requiring a hidden teacher. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea can function as a what-if mood. What if survivors of a disrupted world bring fragments of knowledge into new settlements? Not as advanced machines, but as practices, stories, and social habits that help communities cohere. Historians still argue whether early agriculture begins primarily as a response to resource stress and climate instability, or as an opportunity seized by increasingly sedentary groups in resource-rich environments, or as a mix that shifts by place. You walk along the stream and notice plants at the edge, low and thick, seeds, stalks. You can imagine people learning which plants are worth returning to, which ones produce more, which ones can be encouraged. Archaeology suggests that over time, humans begin selecting for certain traits in plants, leading to domestication. That part is mainstream. It's slow. It's cumulative. It's not flashy. It's 1,000 small decisions rather than one big revelation. Now we bring back the last Anunnaki king vanished as a narrative device in this migration context. What if the last king is not a man lost to a wave, but a role that cannot survive the move inland? A king of coasts, of tides of fish, runs of maritime routes. Once you are in the river valley, the old symbols don't work. The driftwood scepter looks silly next to the demands of planting and storage. Authority shifts from reading the sea to managing labour, from predicting tides to predicting harvests. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it fits the emotional logic of myth. Old orders fade, new orders rise. The story needs a turning point, and a vanished king makes a clean hinge. Second light joke. Imagine the king trying to give a ceremonial speech about the glory of the ocean while everyone is staring at the river like, can we please focus on where we're going to sleep? The court poet would be fired. The logistics person would be promoted. Civilization begins with someone saying, okay, who's in charge of food? You stop at a bend where the stream widens. You hear insects. You hear frogs. You hear your own breath. The landscape is generous, but it demands planning. You picture small shelters, repeated returns, then longer stays. You picture people learning to store, to build, to manage. Archaeology suggests that such transitions unfold over long periods with many intermediate stages. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can't confirm a named king in this time. We can confirm that humans adapt, and eventually build the foundations that later become urban life. One interpretation is that myths of vanished rulers preserve emotional memory of these transitions, and the cinematic what if stays a whisper. What if the last Anunnaki king vanishes as the old world's symbol, and in his absence a new kind of authority begins, quieter, more practical and harder to sing about? You keep walking along the stream, letting the water's steady sound smooth your thoughts, and you feel the story sliding naturally toward the places where writing cities and named kings will one day appear, even if tonight you are still wandering in the long dusk before those lights turn on. You keep moving along the low ground where water collects and life crowds close to it. The air is softer here, thicker with the smell of mud and green growth. Your steps leave faint impressions in damp soil, and the night sounds are busier: frogs, insects, a distant bird that cannot sleep, like it has an appointment at sunrise. The driftwood rests in your hand, warm by your palm, light enough to forget until it taps a stone and reminds you it exists. It feels almost out of place in this inland world, but that is what stories do. They bring old worlds into new ones, whether the new world asks for them or not. Most historians agree that early farming develops over long periods in parts of the Fertile Crescent, with people gradually shifting from gathering wild plants to cultivating and domesticating certain crops and animals. The evidence we do have points to experimentation, selection, and slow change, rather than a single invention moment. Archaeology suggests that communities begin managing cereals and legumes in certain regions, and later animals, creating a more predictable food base over time. Historians still argue whether agriculture begins mostly from necessity, like pressures from climate swings or population, or from opportunity like abundant wild resources encouraging longer stays, or from a mix that changes by place. That debate matters because farming is not just a menu change, it is a lifestyle change, and lifestyle changes always have a hidden cost, like when you decide to become a morning person and then realise mornings arrive every day. You walk to a patch where grasses stand higher, their heads heavy with seeds. You brush your fingers along them and feel the roughness, the tiny, prickly stubbornness of wild grain. You can imagine someone noticing year after year that the best stands grow in certain soils, near certain water, after certain burns. Archaeology suggests that repeated harvesting and replanting can slowly shift plant traits, making certain grains easier to gather, easier to process, and eventually more dependent on human care. Most historians agree that domestication is a relationship, not a magic trick. Plants change people, and people change plants. One interpretation is that early cultivation begins as a way to smooth uncertainty. If you cannot count on hunting to be good every season, if shoreline resources are shifting, if winter feels less predictable, you might start leaning harder on what you can encourage and store. A careful reading might suggest that farming is not only about abundance, it is about control, or at least the hope of control. Bread, after all, is basically a way to tell tomorrow, you'll not surprise me as much. Here comes a light joke, because this is where your modern brain needs one. Imagine explaining to a group of early cultivators that you have a revolutionary invention called meal prep. They would stare at you, then point at a pile of grain and say, "Yes, we invented that now. Please stop talking and help with the grinding stone." You keep walking and notice a subtle shift in the land. Slight ridges, small clearings, places where the vegetation looks a little different, less wild, more encouraged. It could be natural, it could be people. The evidence we do have points to humans shaping landscapes in many ways through burning, harvesting, selective tending, and repeated use of certain places. Archaeology suggests that even before full farming, some groups intensify particular resources in ways that blur the line between foraging and cultivation. Now bring in the price of stability. Most historians agree that farming can support larger populations and more permanent settlements, but it also brings new vulnerabilities. Reliance on a narrower set of crops can be risky. Stored food can attract pests. Living closer together can increase the spread of illness. Labour becomes more demanding and repetitive. The evidence we do have points to mixed outcomes. More food security in some ways, more work, and new stresses in others. Second light joke. If you ever want to understand early farming, think about how you feel when you realise you have to do dishes every day. Not once, not occasionally every day. Now replace dishes with harvesting, grinding, planting, weeding, storing, guarding, and doing it again. Stability is wonderful, but it is also relentlessly scheduled. One interpretation is that the shift toward farming changes power. When food can be stored, someone can manage storage. When land matters, someone can claim land. When labour is coordinated, someone can coordinate labour. A careful reading might suggest that the path toward formal leadership and eventually kingship becomes easier once there are granaries, fields, and permanent places that need managing. This is where we handle your title idea gently and safely. The Anunnaki as a term and a group in later Mesopotamian mythology belong to a written world far later than the first steps toward agriculture. That is mainstream ground. So if we mention a last Anunnaki king here, we do it as an imaginative lens, not as a confirmed identity. A fringe idea proposes that early agriculture appears so quickly or so dramatically that it must have been guided by outside knowledge, sometimes folded into modern Anunnaki narratives. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for a hidden teacher civilization is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that humans, given time necessity and social learning, can invent and refine complex practices without needing a secret instructor. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can become a powerful what-if mood. What if the last king, whatever that means in this story, is the last representative of a roaming coastline-shaped order, and he vanishes, not in a flash, but in a trade made by a community consciously or not choosing stability over old freedoms. You picture it in a calm, cinematic way, a group standing at the edge of a floodplain watching the river's slow pulse. Someone points to the soil and says, "It is rich, it is dependable, it is worth staying." Another person looks toward the distant direction of salt air and says, "The old world is gone, and staying is not surrender, it is survival." In this mood, the king is not a man with jewels. The king is a symbol of the old pattern, the old authority tied to roots, tides and movement. And the vanishing is the moment the group stops needing that symbol. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You crouch near the water and see tracks in the mud, small ones. Maybe birds, maybe something else. You imagine animals being watched, then managed, then penned. Most historians agree that animal domestication also unfolds over time, with sheep, goats, cattle and pigs domesticated in different regions and phases. Archaeology suggests a slow shift in herd management and human relationships with animals. It is not just a food story, it is a social story. Third light joke. The first person to successfully keep animals near camp probably felt like a genius, right until the animals did what animals do, which is escape, eat the wrong thing, make noise at the worst time, and generally act like they have never heard of a plan. You can almost hear an early herder muttering, "Why is everyone so dramatic?" while the goats sprint away like tiny chaos machines. Now bring the promise of bread into the theme. Most historians agree that cereals become central to many early farming communities, and that grinding, baking and cooking transform daily life. The evidence we do have points to tools like grinding stones, storage pits and hearths, becoming more common in settled contexts. One interpretation is that bread or bread-like foods becomes a symbol of stability, a daily reassurance you can hold in your hands. So here is the whispered, what if, the one that fits your section's heart. What if the last Anunnaki king vanishes in the same moment bread becomes a promise? Not because anyone signs a deal, but because the community's centre of gravity shifts. You stop living by the horizon and start living by the field edge. You stop measuring life by the tide and start measuring it by the harvest. The old authority dissolves and a new kind begins to form, quieter, more managerial, less mythic in the moment, but more likely to leave records later. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can't confirm a named king in this deep time. We can confirm people changing how they live, gradually choosing stability and paying its price. You stand letting your joints loosen, letting the night air settle on your skin. The driftwood warms under your fingers, still a piece of the moving world, carried into a place where the future is starting to prefer staying put. Your walking slows in a way that isn't fatigue so much as focus. The land around you feels busier now, not in the modern sense of traffic and signage, but in the sense of repeated human attention. A place people return to, a place shaped by hands and habits. The air carries faint smoke even when you don't see fire, as if the soil itself remembers old hearths. The driftwood is still in your hand, but it feels like a relic now, something from a different chapter. You keep it anyway because humans are sentimental creatures, and because it is your quiet thread through the long dark. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamia, the roots of later Sumerian civilization stretch back through earlier periods, including the Ubaid and Uruk, with gradual development of larger settlements, complex economies, and eventually writing. The evidence we do have points to long continuity and change, not a sudden appearance of Sumer fully formed. Archaeology suggests that irrigation tradecraft, specialization, and social organization develop over time as settlements grow. Historians still argue whether the primary engine of early complexity in southern Mesopotamia is irrigation-driven agricultural surplus trade networks, religious institutions, social competition, or a shifting mix of all these. That is your debate phrase, and it matters here because it stops you from treating civilization like a single invention. It grows, it accumulates, it improvises. You follow a riverbank in your imagination now, even if your feet are still on old earth. The river is wide, slow and heavy, carrying silt, the way a storyteller carries plot. You smell wet clay. You see reeds. You see birds settling in for the night. You begin to feel how a river valley can become a magnet pulling people close, making life both easier and more complicated. Most historians agree that before writing, you can still have complex settlements. The evidence we do have points to large villages, to communal buildings, to craft production, to long-distance exchange of materials like obsidian and shell. Archaeology suggests that as people live closer together, social systems become more formal because too many neighbours require rules, and rules require someone to enforce them, or at least argue about them loudly. Here comes your first light joke of the section. Civilization is basically the moment humans invent the concept of "your noise is bothering me" and then spend the next 10,000 years arguing about it. You can almost hear an ancient neighbour complaining about someone's goats, like it's the oldest form of a group chat complaint. Now we approach the heart of this section, Sumer before Sumer feels real. This is where you can sense the long ramp toward the world that will later produce written myths, king lists, and named gods. What's broadly accepted is that the earliest cuneiform writing appears in late Uruk contexts, initially for accounting and administration. The evidence we do have points to clay tokens, bullae, and early pictographic tablets evolving into writing systems. Archaeology suggests that bureaucracy, labour management, and trade coordination drive early record keeping. One interpretation is that writing begins not because people want poetry, but because they need to count. Count grain, count livestock, count beer rations, count Labour Days. A careful reading might suggest that civilization often starts with someone saying, "Please write that down, because my memory is not a reliable storage system." Honestly, That is the most relatable thing ancient humans ever did. The second light joke. If you were there, you would absolutely volunteer to be the scribe because you think it sounds prestigious, and then you discover the job is mostly tally marks and repetitive lists, and you'd be like, wait, where is the epic adventure? The epic adventure is accounting. Welcome to adulthood. Now we bring in the king idea with mainstream grounding. Most historians agree that by the time we have texts in Mesopotamia, kingship is a recognizable institution tied to city-states, temples, warfare and administration. The evidence we do have points to rulers building monuments, commissioning works, and claiming legitimacy through divine association. Archaeology suggests that temples and palaces become important centres of power, though the exact balance between religious and secular authority varies. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian kingship grows primarily out of temple administration, military leadership, or a more blended evolution, where multiple power centres compete and merge. That debate matters because it frames kingship as something that develops, not something that appears out of nowhere in deep prehistory. So when you hear Anunnaki king, you keep your monetization safe, framing this as later mythic language and later cultural memory, not a confirmed Ice Age monarchy. One interpretation is that later scribes living in a world of cities and kings might retrofit earlier eras with king-shaped figures. A careful reading might suggest that the deep past gets painted with familiar colours. A time before writing becomes a stage where the first kings are imagined larger than life, and the cinematic what-if mood returns gentle and vivid. What if the last Anunnaki king is a story shaped at the moment myth and administration begin to overlap, when people start writing down not only counts but origins? You picture a room lit by oil lamps, clay tablets stacked, a reed stylus in a hand. Outside, a canal reflects starlight. Inside, someone speaks a name as if it matters to the universe. The scribe presses the stylus into clay and leaves a wedge mark that will outlast the voice. The evidence we do have points to writing turning spoken tradition into durable record, but it also turns flexible stories into fixed versions. That matters for myth. A fringe idea proposes that certain Mesopotamian myths preserve literal historical records of much older ages, including advanced beings and catastrophic resets. This theory isn't widely accepted as straightforward history, and evidence for literalness is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that myth preserves cultural memory, ideology, and symbolic truth rather than direct repetage. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask, what if the flood divider in later king lists is a way of marking a felt rupture, a line between worlds? Not necessarily a single event you can date to a year, but a narrative line that tells listeners there was a before and then there was an after. You feel the driftwood again and realise it is an object from before carried into a world that is starting to prefer clay. A piece of sea carried into a place where rivers build cities. The contrast is almost poetic on purpose. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia's environment requires human management. including irrigation and canal maintenance to support large populations. Archaeology suggests that labour coordination, water control and storage create both opportunity and conflict. One interpretation is that when a society's survival depends on organised work, authority becomes formal and legitimacy becomes precious. A careful reading might suggest that myths about divine assemblies and cosmic order help justify human order. Now the cinematic what if takes a careful step. What if the last Anunnaki king is not a being walking through the streets, but a mythic memory of a final authority that belonged to the old world, the world before canals and tablets, before counted rations and written rules? What if the vanishing is the moment the story of kingship transitions from oral symbol to written institution? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Third light joke. Imagine the last old-style leader trying to give a grand speech about the sea and the stars, and the new bureaucrat interrupts like, "That's beautiful. But we need your seal impression for the barley distribution. Myth meets paperwork. Paperwork wins. Every time." You stand at the riverbank in your mind and listen to water sliding past reeds. You can almost hear the future arriving in small sounds. A stylus scratching clay, a gate opening on a canal, a storehouse door closing. The driftwood is warm in your hand, a reminder that the past is portable, but the future tends to settle in. And you keep walking toward the point where names, gods and kings become part of the written record, knowing that once words are pressed into clay, they can outlast truth, outlast debate, and outlast the people who first whispered them. You don't stop walking, but your imagination changes rooms again. You leave the riverbank and step into lamplight, into clay dust, into that quiet indoor hush, where every sound feels like it matters. The air smells like oil smoke and damp earth. Your fingers feel gritty, as if you have been handling tablets all night, even though you are still only holding driftwood sea, pale salt polished warm from your palm. It's almost funny carrying driftwood into a world that prefers clay, because clay keeps receipts and driftwood keeps moods. Still, you keep the stick with you because it has become your little promise that we won't lose the shoreline while we talk about temples. Most historians agree that in ancient Mesopotamian religion, the Anunnaki appear in texts as a group of deities, and the exact way the term is used can shift by time and genre. The evidence we do have points to a complex pantheon where different gods hold different roles, and where divine groups can function like assemblies, families, or categories. Archaeology suggests that temples' offerings and religious institutions become deeply woven into daily life as cities grow. Historians still argue whether the word Anunnaki always refers to the same group across time, whether it shifts in meaning depending on context, and how its association with the underworld or divine council changes between periods. That sentence is your caution tape. It wraps neatly around the topic and says, slow down, read carefully, do not sprint into certainty. Because this is where modern retellings often grab one definition and treat it like a universal key. One interpretation is that later readers, especially modern ones, sometimes literalize poetic or religious language, turning symbolic beings into historical rulers. A careful reading might suggest that ancient texts are not trying to be modern history books. They are doing theology, politics, ritual, and meaning all at once. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a useful lens. It helps you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You imagine yourself standing in a temple courtyard at night. The stones hold heat. The air is still. Somewhere a priest lights a lamp and the flame wobbles, as if it is thinking about the wind. In the distance, water moves through canals with the soft persistence of a sleepy animal breathing. This is the kind of place where divine names feel real, because everything around you is built to make them feel real. Now, mainstream anchor, again clear and calm. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion includes texts like hymns, myths, and ritual instructions, and those texts reflect how people understand the world and power. The evidence we do have points to gods connected to cities, kings, natural forces, and moral order. In that framework, the Anunnaki can appear as a collective group in the divine hierarchy rather than a list of human monarchs you can put on a timeline. Here comes your first light joke, because the brain relaxes when it smiles. If you walked into an ancient temple and asked for a simple chart explaining who is who in the pantheon, they would hand you 3 tablets, 6 hymns, and a stern look, and you would still be confused. Honestly, that's not even ancient. That's just any complicated family tree. One interpretation is that groups like the Anunnaki function as narrative tools. They help a story talk about cosmic authority without listing every individual god each time. A careful reading might suggest that when a text says the assembly of the gods decides it is describing a worldview where order is maintained by a hierarchy above humans, and when kings later claim divine support, they are linking their authority to that cosmic structure. Now we gently bring back your title thread without pretending it is a proven historical person. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the phrase last Anunnaki king could be a modern. What if that asks what happens when a society stops imagining authority as cosmic and starts imagining it as administrative? What if the story is pointing at a shift in how power is explained? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying there was a literal Anunnaki king ruling in 13,000 years ago. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is not mainstream history. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki are deities in later texts. The interpretation is that mythic language can be read too literally. The imagination is that a king could be a symbol of an older order that fades. You glance at the driftwood again and notice how it looks almost like a small staff in lamplight, a silly little scepter made of beach leftovers. It makes you smile because it fits the mood, and because it reminds you not to worship your own symbols. Symbols are useful, but they can also lead you around like a leash if you let them. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but literal advanced beings, sometimes described in modern retellings as visitors who ruled humanity and then disappeared. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin in mainstream archaeology and Assyriology. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient cultures used divine language to talk about power, fate, and the forces shaping life, and that modern audiences sometimes translate that into science fiction, because science fiction is the modern language of awe. Second light joke. You know how people read a recipe online and then leave a comment like, "I replaced the flour with sand and the sugar with salt, and it was terrible, 1 star." That is what happens when you take a myth, replace symbolism with literalism, and then complain, "The world does not make sense." Sometimes you have to cook the text the way it was meant to be cooked. Still, we don't have to mock the curiosity. Curiosity is fine. The key is to frame it safely. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the ancient alien rumour becomes a modern myth about old myths. It tells you something about what people want from the past. They want a secret. They want a hidden truth. They want a single answer that makes everything click. But deep time is not a lock that opens with one key. It is a room full of keys that mostly belong to doors we can't find anymore. Most historians agree that the earliest written myths and lists in Mesopotamia arise thousands of years after the Ice Age in societies with temples, cities, and rulers who use writing to manage resources and legitimacy. Archaeology suggests that writing transforms memory. It stabilizes some stories and freezes them into versions that can outlast debate. One interpretation is that when a myth is written down, it can begin to feel like a record, even if it was never meant to be one. Historians still argue whether certain mythic figures and divine groups preserve older oral traditions, reflect contemporary political needs, or blend multiple layers of meaning that shift with each retelling. You let that sit. It is a gentle reminder that even written words are not pure windows into the past. They are crafted objects like pottery shaped by hands, needs, and style. Now the cinematic what if returns quiet and careful. What if the last Anunnaki king is not a flesh and blood ruler, but a ritual role that ends when the world changes? Imagine a very old pattern of authority, not based on stored grain, but on reading signs, water, sky, seasons. A person who speaks for order. Over centuries, as societies settle, as canals cut the land, as tablets count rations, that role becomes less central. Not because it was fake, but because the new world needs different skills. The king vanishes because the job description changes. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That is an imaginative possibility, not a certainty, but it fits a common human pattern. We keep the title even after the duties change. We keep the story even after the world that produced it is gone. And sometimes we invent a dramatic ending to explain a slow fade, because slow fades are hard to sing. Third light joke, soft and sleepy. If you ever want to watch a role vanish in real time, try calling yourself the remote work king when your Wi-Fi dies. You are instantly demoted to person holding a useless laptop. Titles are fragile. Electricity is humbling. Ancient canals were their version of Wi-Fi, and whoever managed them suddenly mattered. You walk past a temple wall in your mind and listen to the quiet murmur of people inside prayers. Footsteps, the scrape of a reed stylus. You hold driftwood in your hand like a tiny reminder of the sea that used to be closer, the world that used to be different. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are complex, layered, and deeply tied to the societies that produced them. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki, as divine figures, can be read as part of a symbolic language about authority and cosmic order, not as a secret roster of prehistoric kings. And the what if stays where it belongs, calm and useful. What if the story of a vanished king is really the story of humans moving from one kind of certainty to another, from shoreline to canal, from oral memory to clay, from the mist to the ledger? You keep walking slow and steady, letting that thought settle into you the way silt settles in a quiet river bend. Not as proof, but as a gentle shape that makes the night feel coherent. You step out of the temple hush and back into open air, and the night feels cooler against your face, like a gentle reset. Somewhere nearby, water moves through a canal, not wild, not unpredictable, but guided, disciplined, shaped by walls and gates. The sound is steady, controlled, the kind of sound that would make you trust the future, even if you shouldn't trust anything too much in a world built on mud. The driftwood stays with you, and now it feels like the oddest thing in the city landscape. A pale stick from the sea in a place where the main religion is paperwork. But you keep it anyway, because it's your thread, and because you like holding something that doesn't have a stamp on it. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian king lists mix historical rulers with legendary ones, and that they often serve political and ideological purposes, not just neutral record keeping. The evidence we do have points to these lists being copied and edited over time, reflecting how later scribes and elites understood the past. Archaeology suggests that as writing spreads, it becomes a tool for authority, memory, and legitimacy. Historians still argue whether the earliest portions of king lists preserve faint memories of real pre-dynastic leaders, or whether they are mainly mythic constructs designed to extend legitimacy backward into a glorious and orderly past. That's your debate phrase, and it matters because it tells you exactly where you can stand and where the fog begins. You imagine a scribe hunched over clay stylus in hand lamplight flickering. The room smells like warm oil and damp earth. The scribe presses wedges into fresh clay, making names durable. There's a special kind of power in that act. Writing makes a thing feel true even when it is complicated. Writing can turn rumour into lineage. One interpretation is that king lists are not just lists. A careful reading might suggest they are stories disguised as administration. They say order exists, authority flows. There was a beginning and it leads to us. In a society that lives with floods, droughts, and political upheaval, that narrative is comforting. It's like telling yourself your life makes sense because it has chapters, even when it mostly feels like a pile of unrelated events and one long email thread. First light joke of the section. If you have ever tried to write a neat timeline of your own life, you know you immediately start editing. You leave out the embarrassing haircut year. You turn the messy breakup into a period of personal growth. Ancient scribes were not immune to this. Everyone is the hero of their own archive. Most historians agree that one famous feature of Mesopotamian king lists is the idea of a dividing event often described as a flood separating earlier rulers from later ones. The evidence we do have points to this flood line functioning as a narrative hinge, but its relationship to any specific historical flood event is debated. Historians still argue whether the flood divider reflects a memory of a particular catastrophe, a symbolic reset, a political statement, or a blend of all three. Now we handle your last Anunnaki king idea in a monetization safe way that fits this section. One interpretation is that the flood line gives storytellers a perfect place to put a vanishing. If you want to explain why the old rulers are unreachable, you place them before the flood. If you want to suggest a cosmic break, you put it there. A careful reading might suggest that the flood is as much a literary device as it is a memory. And now the cinematic what if mood, calm and vivid. What if the last Anunnaki king is the last name on that mythic side of the line, the final figure before the waters rise and the record breaks? Not a confirmed person, but a story shaped to make the rupture feel complete. A king vanishes, and then the world begins again. With rulers you can recognize, rulers who build, fight, and leave inscriptions. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You walk through an imagined archive, stacks of clay tablets. Some are administrative, some are hymns, some are stories, some are copies of copies. The smell is dusty and earthy, like baked mud and time. You realize something quietly unsettling in a calm way. The archive is selective. It keeps what the powerful want kept. It loses what nobody recopies. The evidence we do have is not the evidence that existed. It is the evidence that survived. Second light joke. If you think modern cloud storage is unreliable, imagine ancient cloud storage. The cloud is literal. The storage is mud. A single flood could wipe your entire database, and nobody can restore previous version. You'd be devastated, and also you'd probably blame a god, because that's emotionally healthier than admitting you didn't back up your data. Now we bring in the truth ladder lines woven gently. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A fringe idea proposes that king lists are coded histories of incredibly ancient epochs, including divine or semi-divine rulers who lived for impossible spans of time. This theory isn't widely accepted in a literal sense, and a more cautious explanation could be that exaggerated reign lengths are symbolic, ideological, or mythic, not calendar years. Still, the presence of long reigns and pre-flood rulers is a real feature of the tradition, and it naturally invites imaginative questions. One interpretation is that extraordinary reign lengths could express a worldview where the early age is closer to the divine, less constrained by ordinary human limits. A careful reading might suggest that the old world is supposed to feel bigger, stranger, and more potent, so later times feel like a descent into ordinary reality. That is a common mythic pattern across many cultures. And now your what if stays gentle. What if the 13,000-year cataclysm is a modern way of anchoring that mythic floodline to a real era of environmental upheaval and shoreline change? Not because we can confirm a direct connection, but because it feels plausible that human memory of water and disruption could echo across time, reshaped again and again. Historians still argue whether any specific ancient flood story maps to one event, multiple events, or mostly symbolic storytelling. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pause beside the canal and listen. The water is controlled here. It moves where people tell it to move. That alone is a kind of cultural statement. The city is saying we can manage chaos. We can schedule nature. We can make the world predictable enough to count. One interpretation is that this is exactly why flood myths remain powerful. Because even in a canal city, you still know the river can break your walls. You still know the sky can change. You still know your control is temporary. Third light joke. If you ever want to humble yourself, try to control water with a garden hose for 5 minutes. You will immediately learn that water does what it wants, and your confidence is made of paper. Ancient engineers probably felt the same every time a canal silted up overnight. Now bring the last king vanishes threads into this moment of writing and editing. What if the last Anunnaki king vanishes not in the water itself, but in the act of recording? A scribe chooses where to place the rupture. A scribe chooses which names belong to mythic time. A scribe chooses to end an old line with a figure that feels final. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a powerful reminder the past we inherit is partly the past someone decided to preserve. You hold the driftwood and imagine it placed on a table beside a wet clay tablet. 2 materials, 2 kinds of memory. The sea smoothed the wood. The scribe fixes the clay. Both are real, both are fragile. Both can vanish, and you keep walking along the canal, listening to the steady water, letting the idea settle that sometimes the vanishing of a king is not a secret assassination or a cosmic beam, but a quiet fade into the line where story becomes record and record becomes authority. The canal water keeps moving beside you, soft and steady, like it's trying to teach your nervous system a new rhythm. The city night is quieter than you might expect. Not silent, but controlled, a place where sounds know their lanes. A distant dog barks, once then stops. Somewhere a door closes gently. Somewhere a lamp sputters and steadies. You breathe in the smell of wet clay and smoke, and feel how human it is, how familiar even across thousands of years. The driftwood is warm in your hand, and now it feels like the last stubborn piece of shoreline you've carried all the way into this world of canals and tablets. It's simple. It's uninscribed. It doesn't claim anything. It just exists in a way that makes it the perfect symbol for tonight's truth ladder. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian flood stories and king lists reflect a blend of myth ideology and historical memory shaped by societies that lived alongside rivers, capable of both nourishing and destroying. Archaeology suggests that writing and administration become central tools of power, and that kingship, religion, and economy intertwine in complex ways. That's the mainstream ground you can stand on without wobbling. Historians still argue whether the flood divider in Mesopotamian traditions echoes specific ancient flood events, preserves older oral memories of environmental upheaval, functions mainly as a symbolic reset, or combines all of these in layered ways. That debate is the heartbeat of our what if. It is the reason we can explore without pretending we have solved anything. One interpretation is that when later societies write down myths of floods and divine assemblies, they are not simply reporting, they are making meaning. A careful reading might suggest that the flood is a narrative tool for saying the world we live in is not the first world. The old world ended. Something was lost. Something changed, and the best way to talk about that change is to draw a line, then place a figure at the line, a last name, a last authority, a last king. Now your question returns in its final gentle form. What if the last Anunnaki king vanished in the 13,000-year Cataclysm, treated as a possibility rather than a conclusion? The king can be a symbol that bridges multiple layers of memory. Not a confirmed Ice Age monarch, not a secret ruler you can date, but a story shape that helps humans talk about vanishing certainty. A popular rumour claims that there was once a sophisticated lost civilization erased by a global catastrophe, with its rulers remembered only as gods or semi-gods, sometimes linked in modern retellings to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted in mainstream archaeology, and evidence for a single worldwide wipeout of an advanced civilization is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that many regions experience floods, shoreline shifts and climate swings at different times, and that later societies shaped those experiences into universal stories because universals feel comforting. First light joke, soft and sleepy. You know how people say they lost everything when they dropped their phone and cracked the screen? Now imagine someone in an ancient river city saying we lost everything, and it's literally because the river moved the boundary of the world. Perspective is brutal. Also, please be kind to your ancestors. They did not have screen protectors. Most historians agree that the end of the Ice Age involves sea level rise and climate variability, including debated episodes like the Younger Dryas and various regional inundations. The evidence we do have points to real environmental change. One interpretation is that the memory of such change could echo through oral tradition, transformed by retelling merged with later experiences, and eventually written down in mythic form. A careful reading might suggest that written flood stories are layered river floods, coastal submergence, social collapse, political resets, and human fear of water all stacked like silt. And now the cinematic what if moves in close, but remains calm. What if the last king vanishes in stages, not one dramatic moment, but a slow dissolving? What if he vanishes first from the shoreline, when rising water or changing tides make old camps unlivable and old routes meaningless? What if he vanishes next from the sky when seasons feel unpredictable and the old signs fail? What if he vanishes again from the social world when people settle, store grain, manage canals, and authority shifts from a keeper of roots to a keeper of records? And what if finally he vanishes into text when scribes place him before the flood line in the mythic age where the past becomes safe to admire because it cannot be questioned? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That is imaginative possibility, not certainty. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Second light joke. If you want to see how a title can outlive its meaning, look at someone who still calls themselves the group's planner after they have forgotten every birthday for 3 years straight. Titles are sticky. Reality is slippery. Ancient kingship and divine language can be sticky too, lingering long after the context changes. You stand by the canal and listen to the water as if it is speaking. It doesn't speak in words, but it does speak in patterns. Flow, pause, ripple, steady pull. You think about how humans build stories the same way. We take patterns, we attach meaning, we pass them on. Archaeology suggests that material culture, like tablets, seals buildings and tools, gives you one kind of evidence. Myth gives you another kind, not data but worldview. One interpretation is that myths can preserve emotional truth even when factual details are uncertain. A careful reading might suggest that the flood myth is a way of saying, we live with forces beyond us, and yet we build anyway. We count anyway. We pray anyway. We lead anyway. The king divine or human is a stand-in for the desire that someone is steering. Historians still argue whether ancient Mesopotamian myths should be read primarily as theological statements, political legitimization, moral instruction, reflections of environmental reality, or blended narratives serving multiple purposes at once. You can hold that multiplicity without strain. You can let the flood be both memory and metaphor. You can let the Anunnaki be deities in texts, while also acknowledging how modern audiences reinterpret them. You can let the last king be a poetic device that makes the transition from one world to another feel narratable. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient texts contain coded knowledge about prehistoric events, including catastrophic floods and advanced rulers, and that careful decoding reveals a hidden history. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often assumes a level of intentional encryption that is hard to demonstrate. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the urge to decode is human. We want the past to be a puzzle because puzzles promise a solution and solutions promise comfort. Third light joke, quiet. If you have ever tried to decode a friend's short text message and then realized they were just busy and not secretly mad at you, congratulations, you have practiced ancient myth interpretation in modern form. Your brain is a meaning machine. It will manufacture meaning out of fog if you let it. You look at the driftwood one last time and imagine it placed on a clay tablet, not as evidence, but as a reminder. The sea shaped this wood. The scribe shaped this clay. Both are shaped by time. Both can vanish. Coastlines disappear. Stories change. Records survive unevenly. The past is not a straight hallway, it is a room full of half-lit corners. And then very gently, you let the question settle into its final bedtime shape. What if the last Anunnaki king vanished in the 13,000-year cataclysm? Maybe the best answer is not a yes or no. Maybe the best answer is that the story points at a real human experience. The feeling of standing on familiar ground and realizing it will not stay familiar. The feeling of watching water cross a line. The feeling of authority failing and then reforming in a new shape. The feeling of needing a name for loss, so you give loss a king to carry. The canal water keeps flowing. Your breathing slows. Your shoulders drop. The city night stays quiet and the stars above remain indifferent but beautiful. Now the wind down begins and you let everything soften. You let the crisp edges of debate blur into calm. You don't need to solve the flood line tonight. You don't need to decide exactly which waters moved where or when or how fast. You can trust what's broadly accepted, the planet changes, and humans adapt. You can respect what scholars debate, the timing, the mechanisms, the meanings. And you can enjoy what imagination offers a gentle. What if a symbolic king, a quiet vanishing that makes a long transition feel like a story your sleepy mind can hold? In your mind, you set the driftwood down beside the canal. It rests on the stone edge, pale against the dark. Water murmurs. A lamp flickers somewhere. The air is cool and safe. The city sleeps. You feel the steady rhythm of your own breath in and out like a small tide that belongs only to you. You watch the reflections on the canal surface for a moment longer, the moon broken into soft pieces, then stitched back together as the ripples settle, and as your eyelids grow heavier, you let the last Anunnaki king be what he has been all night. Not a proven fact, not a hidden truth, but a quiet symbol, standing at the edge of change, dissolving gently into the mist where certainty ends and rest begins.